anybody there? I'm not seeing anyone on my screen yet. Okay, good. There's Chris. Who else do we have? All right. Okay, so the complication I have is that I'm the only one here in the room in City Hall, so I'm doing the cameras and all of that stuff. So I'll be kind of running back and forth. I think Charlie O'Donnell might join me. So if you are ready, I guess we can go ahead and get started.
Sure, let's see. We have 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we've got 7 of our committee members so far. And I think Jim's in the waiting room. And Drew. Okay. Okay. So while everybody's joining us, I'll just real quickly go over, thank you for joining us today in this busy season, and just spend a couple minutes. You've seen on the agenda that there's 3 parts to today's meeting. We have continued discussion of the policy analysis of the strategies with the goal of getting a better understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of each of the 6 that we have remaining. We started with 14, and we did the vote, and now we're down to 6. We're going to get an update or provide a brief update on the subdivision subcommittee's work in regards to increasing open space in new subdivisions and the potential vote in support of those efforts. And then finally, we are going to rank our remaining strategies so that we can focus on the top 1, possibly 2 going forward, depending on our time frame and the amount of effort that the top ones would require in terms of drafting ordinance language and discussion. So before we jump into the first order of business, at last month's meeting, we started the discussion, and there were a couple of requests for some additional data, particularly in regards to sea level rise. And so to start out, Phil is actually going to provide us an overview and a few general points of data for your benefit. So hopefully Phil has screen sharing abilities.
Yeah, I think I do. So, as Jen said at the last meeting, there was a request to sort of clarify both previous and future sea level rise numbers. So the past is easier because we have the data. The future is based on projections, and so they're based on modeling. So I've looked at, gone out and tried to find the a number of different projections, and specifically for Lewis. So there is the tide gauge in Lewis, and so we do have some very specific data for the city, and so that's what I'm going to share with you now. Host disabled participant screen sharing. I do not. So Anne Marie, sorry. You're gonna get a workout today, Anne Marie.
That's okay. It's not going to kill me. All right, you should be good.
Yep. All right. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen here. And so this is the first data point that I'm going to provide for you is the historic linear overall trend as far back as 1919. So tide gauges first started to be measured in 1919, all the way up to this year. And the overall trend in sea level rise, that's this column. You can't see the column heading, but it's 3.57 millimeters per year going all the way back to 1919. Now that is a linear trend that is a best fit for because it's noisy data, it goes up and down, right? But overall, in the past, starting at 1919, the trend for sea level rise is 3.57 millimeters per year up to this point. Now, this is masking we know that sea level rise is not happening in a linear fashion, right? So because climate change is getting worse, this number is skewed on the lower end for more recent time periods. And so when you look at numbers in the future, they're going to be higher than this number. So let's look at what some of those numbers are. So that's not the right slide. So this is from NOAA, and these are the rates of sea level rise looking out in the future years. Okay, so if it's 3.57 in the past, this row right here is the average intermediate scenario. So basically what this means is that it's a 50-50 chance of it being these numbers. So there's a 50% chance of it being below this, and there's a 50% chance of it being above this. So by let's just pick 2070, you're looking at about 13 millimeters per year, 50% chance below that, 50% chance above that. And if you go up to this table, that gives you a total sea level rise in 2070 by about 0.57 meters. By the end of the century, about 1.0 meters, right? Okay, so that is again, a 50% chance of it being below a meter, a 50% chance of it being above 1 meter. So this is from NOAA. If we go to another model from NASA, NASA has a model on sea level rise, and they're not calling it intermediate, they're calling it this SSP 3-7. This is the model. And so if you look at this data, here at the bottom is the rate of sea level rise in millimeters per year for the years 2040 to 2060, and then from 2080 to 2100. So again, in the past, it was 3.5 millimeters per year. In the future, because climate change is worsening, you're going to average about, 50% below, 50% above this, 9.3 millimeters per year in this time period, and then again, it worsens, and so you're looking at about 12 millimeters per year in this time period. So what does that give you by the end of the century? And it's this column, I'm sorry. This is the SSP 3-7. So this is the column we're looking at. 50%, 0.98. So if you remember, NOAA's projection by the end of the century was 1.0. This is 0.98. So again, very close. And again, you've got a 50% chance of it being below this, 50% chance of it being above this. And then the final data set that I have to share with you is the state of Delaware's. And this was developed by John Callahan, who you heard from earlier in our presentations. And John's and the state of Delaware's modeling shows, again, 2100, you're looking at 0.99 meters of sea level rise, and that is at the intermediate scenario. So that is 50% chance that it'll be below that, 50% chance that it'll be above that. So essentially what you're seeing is I've showed you 3 different sets of modeling for future sea level rise. And all of them are relatively consistent, about a meter by the end of the century. I mean, we're looking, you know, a couple millimeters here or there, but 50% chance of about a meter, which is just over 3 feet, you know, 37 inches or something like that by the end of the century. And then I can briefly share, I actually did get some of the raw data from John. Oh, I don't want to hit that. And here's the chart. These are the projections. So 50% chance, 2100. There's your 0.99 meters. And so I converted it to feet. Here you are. You're about 39 inches of sea level rise by the end of the century. That's that point right there. That yellow point right there, or orange. I'm sorry, colorblind. So there you go. I mean, the models are fairly consistent with each other. Future sea level rise rates of about, you know, between double digits, certainly by the end of the century, with total sea level rise about 3 feet. And again, these are probabilistic. We don't have a crystal ball to gaze perfectly, so we have to put probabilities on these projections. And the probabilities that I've showed you are 50%. So there are probabilities. We have probabilities of 5% chance of happening. There are probabilities of 95% chance of happening. For simplicity, I just showed you the break-even middle point.
Great. Thanks, Phil. Does anybody have any questions for Phil? I see Jim's got his hand up.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Yeah, Phil, I saw that the projections, was it based from the year 2000? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so then have those, but you've been collecting data up to 2020, from 1919 to 2020?
Yes.
Has those projections between 2000 and 2020 kind of matched or has the data from 2000 to 2020 matched the projection that you just presented?
So that is a modeling question, and I'm not the modeler, right? I'm just trying to compile the research. I haven't actually done the research, so I'm just compiling what it has shown. If John Callahan was here, he would be better equipped to answer that question for you. And that's an excellent question, and I will ask that question of John, and I can give you an answer at the next meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Great. Anybody else have any questions for Phil? Nope. Okay, great. Emery, Kina's in the waiting room. Sorry, once again, it's up and going. All right, so with that, we are actually going to move on to continue our open discussion. I've sent out the draft table to everyone. And this table is based on our discussion from last month, in addition to some additions that the planning team made. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and bring it up for you all. So it's 4:16. Can everybody see that? Mm-hmm. Yep, great, thank you. Okay, so there's a couple of pages. I'm just going to focus on the first page. It is 4:16, so we have about 45 minutes to get through the discussion and leaving what I estimate to be enough time for the remaining 2 agenda items. And so what we want to do is, essentially walk through this. You had a chance to review it, hopefully, and can provide, before you're looking over it, was there something else that jumped out at you, whether it be something that fell under the criteria or whether it was additional questions in regards to the strategies. We also mixed up the order a little bit, just at this point, see the things that generated a lot of comments from the last one. I'm going to say anything? Okay. So the first one is listed as the real estate disclosure, and I can also zoom in a little bit more if we need to. Let me see if that works. Okay, so at our discussion at the last meeting, we had talked about the real estate disclosure, what it would disclose. There was some discussion about whether should it disclose sea level rise and flooding. There was great addition to talking about addressing access to the actual property and not just real estate disclosure, though in some of our discussions, that idea of addressing access would be something that would be really difficult to actually implement. And so that would be something that if we chose to focus on this, we would have to address going forward, definitely including maps, though, again, the idea is which maps would that be? If you're going to disclose sea level rise, as Phil just presented, there are multiple, though they all agree in general, the idea of which model of sea level rise, what time horizon, do you look at 2070, do you look at 2100, and which scenario. So again, Phil presented all the intermediate scenarios, so that 50-50 scenario, and is that the one that we would actually include in the discussion of the real estate disclosure. Also, acknowledgement of the property was currently in compliance with the free board requirements, as well as acknowledgement of the cumulative substantial damage and improvement requirements that the code has presently. So as you look over the table, does anyone on the committee have some general comments on this, some additional thoughts that as you look it over popped up? And I need to move this out a little bit. I can't see all of you at the moment. There we go. Okay, Kina.
Hi, good afternoon. Sorry for my computer glitches. The last two meetings I've attended, I've had that difficulty, and they were both different, so I apologize for the delay. And I did hear you. I don't know if you knew I was on or not, but I did hear you for a few minutes before coming on. What I would be concerned about is to make sure that there was credibility behind this. So I think it's important that we, in the disclosure, that the resources used are mentioned, or where individuals can research on their own if they want to clarify anything. That's all.
So when you say by resources, you mean what the source of the data is, whether...
Correct, exactly.
Actually understood, and hopefully, if maps are included, that they would have that type of data.
Exactly.
Sure.
Thank you.
Are there any other thoughts, Joe? You're muted, Joe. Sorry, before you get too far. Yep.
You said there's 3 independent sources, but my understanding that all of this, as far as the East Coast is concerned, mainly goes back to a professor at Rutgers, and maybe Phil, and I've had some discussions with him, look into that to see whether what was the real source of this in terms of NOAA and NASA and the state of Delaware. I think John mentioned during his session with us that mentioned this Professor Knopp at Rutgers, who I know at least one expert has questioned some of his conclusions. So can we find out whether there's really 3 independent sources, or there's really only one source, and that data is picked up by 3 different organizations?
Yeah, no, I can respond to that. It's an important point and a good point. So the NOAA projections are based on both NOAA and the Delaware model, and I believe Bob Scarborough is on the call, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, because I think he knows the answer to this. But both are based on the COP design for projecting sea level rise. The NASA the NASA scenarios are a different model source. Yes, but they're not, the NOAA and the Delaware are not identical, right? They are modifications of the COP model, as far as I understand. Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so further thoughts on the real estate disclosure? Or what direction you would want to go with it? If this was a priority, I know a number of you mentioned at the last meeting that you thought this was an important strategy, and so there's some details here. Marta?
Hi.
Hi.
I think we're supposed to be prioritizing the order of which this committee wants to recommend doing these things. Is that correct?
That will be the final task of today's meeting. Yes, we have 6 left. So at this point, we're just kind of meeting through each of them so that you feel like you have an informed position with which to rank them.
And so I don't have any issues with doing the real estate disclosure. I don't know that it will have much impact. There is a question in there under what is the impact column. So I would rather focus on others towards the end of this list here. If we had to choose among them, I mean, if we could do all of them, that's great too.
I absolutely, we agree with you on all those levels. Unfortunately, our timeline for this committee takes us through March, and so it's unlikely that we would really be able to focus in and give it the attention, whichever solution, whichever strategy it is that we go with. It's unlikely that we'll have the time to give it the attention it needs in order to give a good recommendation and draft ordinance language that goes along with it, if we chose more than one, possibly 2. Right. Any other reactions to the table or, thoughts for or against the real estate disclosure? No. And Anne-Marie, there's no one in the room with you, correct?
Just Charlie O'Donnell.
Just Charlie. Okay, great. All right. Well, then with that, I will move on, and we'll have time to come back to some of these. But so the next one was the Resiliency Fund, and we talked about, the questions that came up were very, very logical. Where does the money come from, and where does it go? And so, we're going to talk about, obviously, the geographic impact depends on what the application of the funding is, from both sides. It is a long-term impact. Somebody talked about how we'd be building it up over time in order to use, and it does increase resilience without the use of restrictive ordinances. But there's many options for both. Obviously, from where the money comes from, it's probably property taxes or a real estate, the transfer tax, or some type of hotel accommodations fee, like we've seen in Bethany Beach and in Sussex County. In terms of, we saw nobody spoke about any particular negative impacts on the property values, whereas though again it would be an increase in the actual, in some sort of tax, depending on who felt it. Those funds, however, could be used to leverage other grants, which is something the mayor pointed out. There are some potential equity issues depending on what the funds are used for and where those funds are used for. And it would require some new program administration, right? It needs some committee oversight in terms of deciding, looking at where the expenditures are going, coming up with the criteria for those, and that would be an ongoing new task for the city to do. We also had a question of whether it required a city charter amendment. That might be something we'd have to consider if we went in that general direction. But so committee members, in terms of a resiliency fund, do you have thoughts or reactions in terms of what the options are, what the where you would want the money to go, and pros and cons, other pros and cons for this particular approach? Got a quiet group today. No, Chris? And then Jim.
Yeah, I think I could say that this is not just for the Resiliency Fund, but also the real estate disclosure. I mean, your chart with best practice examples from other places, I think it'd be great. For instance, on the real estate disclosure, it's already happening in other places. If we could get an example of what some of these other areas are doing and putting on there, that might kind of help us spur some ideas about what we want on there. Same for the Resiliency Fund. It's Bethany, right, that has one?
It is Bethany and Sussex, both.
And, to be honest, I don't know what they're doing with their funds, but I think it would be very helpful to know what they're doing.
Sure. It's always a good starting point, and that's why we kind of reviewed best practices, as long as we make sure that we're customizing it for Lewis and thinking ahead for what Lewis would want. Phil?
Yeah, I can just provide a little bit of quick info for the committee and to address Chris's questions there on some of the details. So the city of Bethany essentially launched this fund with, I believe, transfer tax from the Marriott, or transfer or impact. They got the Marriott redevelopment down in Bethany Beach was sort of the biggest lump that started the fund, and then it also included an increase in property taxes in the city of Bethany Beach. To my knowledge, they have not yet used the resiliency reserve money. There's several $1 million in there as of the most recent fiscal year, and they have allocated this money. Again, maybe we should get confirmation from the city, but I believe they're allocating this money simply for redevelopment and government services in the event of a large event. So they're sort of holding on to it until there's some sort of extreme weather event or hazard, and then they need to use it, right? So it's more reactive rather than proactive. The Sussex County has paused their fund because of COVID, and it was an accommodations tax. They are funding it with an accommodations tax on hotels and motels. And they were going to use it for more proactive green infrastructure investments to mitigate flooding in the county. So you sort of have two different models there. But those are the kind of flavors that could exist here.
Okay, and Jim, did you have a follow-up question too?
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you, Phil. Just my thoughts, I would prefer this to be more in the proactive approach, these funds for the proactive approach, and less the reactive approach. And another thought would be, and this might be a question for Anne Marie, has the city ever operated with a surplus at the end of the year?
Yes, we have, most years we have some degree of carry forward that then goes into a reserve fund.
Okay, gotcha. So maybe could there be a percentage of that surplus designated for this fund? Just a thought on that one.
That's certainly a possibility.
Yep, we can put that on the list. Kina, your hand is up. I didn't know if it was still up from the previous time or if you had additional.
No, I'd like to add something. While I agree often with what Jim has to say, I think some should be used for proactive, but I also think we need to keep a certain percentage in reserve so that we have funding available to really address, if something devastated us like the tornadoes did in Kentucky recently. So I don't know what that percentage would be, right offhand, but I do think we need to reserve some. That's my thoughts.
Great, thank you. For emergency usage, right? Okay. Anybody else? A couple of quiet, other thoughts, say Frank or Rodney or Candace? Rodney?
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
think the idea of being proactive is a good one, but it really depends on what the focus is and what the proactive what it is you're going to try and do under a proactive program. I know last time it was mentioned that the money could be there to leverage other grants and things, and that might be a good reason to, as Akina says, to hold on to some of it so that you have it, because if you do have a major storm event with damage or something and funds become available, I don't know whether that kicks in. I don't know how that kicks in, but I think it needs to be looked at in enough detail to figure out and maybe include both ways. It's not either proactive or reactive in my view. And I think the best way to do it, as been said, is to look at precedents in other communities, other locales, see how they're doing it. That's all.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Candace?
I'm a supporter of establishing Resiliency Fund. I don't think it's a question of whether, it's just a question of when. I know the Board of Public Works sets aside some monies for their role in restoring utilities to the community, and I think it's important for the city to also have monies given that their responsibilities fall to road maintenance and other parts of the infrastructure of the city. So I'm a supporter of Resiliency Fund in that way.
Oh, great. Okay, so with that, let me move on to the next page. Oops. There we go. All right, so our next one, strategy, was the revised landscape standards, which we got into some level of detail, so we missed you last month, Rodney.
Yeah, I apologize for that.
No problem, please. But so we did talk about, we currently encourage the use of native species. There was discussion about whether that should become a stronger, there should be stronger languages. There is also, of course, it is something that is being discussed by the subdivision subcommittee, and there is the idea that it could be addressed in zoning as well, and in which case, if it became a part of zoning, it would be applied to more property owners. So it might apply as part of an addition or part of some building permits where it doesn't apply now. There were some great ideas in terms of considering rain gardens and other BMPs as part of those requirements. And the benefits the idea is that it would apply across the city as a whole, but the actual benefits are a little harder to weigh in on, because it would depend on what regulations it is that we strengthen. Would it be focusing on trees? Would it be focusing on salt-tolerant plants? Those types of things. And so, are there general thoughts from the committee, especially Rodney, since you weren't here last month?
Yeah, I have some thoughts on that. I think it's all interconnected. In my view, it's hard to just break it up into one thing or another. For example, I've looked at development plans where they're taking a property and subdividing it into, 30 or 40 lots, and they're meeting a 10% open area, open space requirement. And the way they're doing it is they're creating this tiny little corner in each lot that the lot owner doesn't own, but it qualifies as open space, and it's not connected to anything else. And so it really, when that kind of thing happens, numerically you achieve the requirement, but it goes against what an open space is trying to achieve, which is if it's aggregated and put it together, it might be the same as a whole lot. That could be the developer doesn't develop every possible lot, but ends up with a larger chunk of land that it's more valuable. It could be value from an ecosystem services point of view. It could be a valuable to the community point of view. For example, walks and trails and pathways through Lewis. We could encourage that and have more of them, and we are getting more, and they're kind of wonderful things, but you could use them to really, and that would be a benefit to the city as a whole. And then if you found the ways to link footpaths, for example, with bioswales and ways to manage stormwater management, it becomes an integrated approach, and you get a much bigger bang for the buck. And I think that's going to take a fair amount of work and thinking to do that, but that's the kind of direction from a landscape point of view that I would like the city head into, because you want to get real value for these requirements that you put in. And as someone once said, you can kind of put in all the open space requirements you want, and clever developers and engineers, which that's what they're paid to do, will find ways to meet the requirements, but it doesn't meet the spirit of the requirement. And so I would like to see a focus on that kind of thing. When it comes to things like native plants and so on, I don't mean to lecture everybody, but native plants are great, but I hope you all realize when you say a native plant and everybody comes in and plants October glory red maples everywhere, all those trees are identical genetically. There's no variation. And what makes a resilient habitat is one where there's tremendous variation in the habitat community. And so, for example, I would like to encourage people to maybe, they could plant cultivars if they want to, but how about seed-grown plants? When we planted tupelo trees last year in Canal Front Park, we specifically selected seed-grown tupelos. We could have gotten cultivars, but we didn't want them because each one of those trees is genetically different from the one next to it, and that gives you your greatest resiliency down the long run. So there are little things like that that we could tweak that would, I think, in the rules and regulations. And the other side of it is you don't want to be too darn prescriptive in this. You want to encourage people to use their imagination, come up with different answers and different solutions. And so it's a fine balance between being prescriptive to get what you want, or letting people, let the industry, let the engineers, the landscape architects, and those kinds of people push a little farther and come up with something that's might be better off all the way for everybody. Does that make any sense?
It does to me, and your comments regarding the open space are very well taken, and I think one of our next agenda item is actually looking at what the subdivision subcommittee, say that 5 times fast, came up with in regards to open space, and so we'll look at that a little more deeply. So that, but absolutely, I think that's some great comments. Kina, did you want to add something else?
I want to better understand what Rodney was saying. He referred to the tupelo plants versus the seed grow plants. Could you please explain a little bit more?
Well, the industry is filled with, a lot of places are requiring native plants. Whatever, you can argue all day long whether it's actually indigenous to the area or not, but it's native to North America, it basically qualifies. And what I see happening is that people will plant native plants, but they're cultivars. So they'll plant a park filled with the same maple tree, for example. And what you have to realize is that those maple trees are produced asexually. There's absolutely no genetic variation in them. So if a pathogen comes along and starts attacking them, you don't have any variation in the resiliency of the community. And so I have tried in the later years of my practice to find trees and even shrubs. And believe it or not, they're being grown from petri dishes nowadays. That's where a lot of these plants are started. And so I've been trying to find them that are grown from seed in the field and then grown in the nursery. That's where you're going to get your greatest genetic variation within any population, and that's a good thing. So the tupelos that we planted, we could have gotten cultivars that were all identical genetically, and they would look the same and have the same beautiful fall color and so on, but we specified ones that were produced from seeds so that we begin to ensure this genetic diversity within the community. The other thing is just being a native tree is not good enough. You shouldn't be planting dogwoods in parking lots. It's too hot for them. They didn't evolve there. They didn't evolve in an urban environment. They evolved on the edge of a woodland. So that's just those are the kind of things that should come into play in kind of an intelligent discussion. So you want to push people in that direction, not prescribe it so much.
Did that help, Keena?
Did that answer?
Yep, good. We got a thumbs up. Okay, and we have another question from Marta, or comment from Marta.
I have a question about the native plants. I support native plants for attracting wildlife and birds and all that. How are native plants compared to non-native plants in terms of absorbing water, which is what we're talking about here?
Yeah, it depends entirely on the plant. I could plant weeping willows in here, which are not native, and they suck up so much water you wouldn't believe it. So if that's what your goal is, you can find exotics that will fill that need. But there are also native plants like the bald cypress, for example, which is an enormous it sucks up an enormous amount of water with an extremely fibrous, dense root system. So, for example, if we want to suggest plants that are going to hold the soil and grow in a varied environment, something like a bald cypress, if we want to suggest indigenous plants, the bald cypress is wonderful. You know, bald cypresses grow as street trees in the middle of St. Louis. The reason they grow in an urban environment is because they will grow in a low oxygen environment. That's what water is. Growing in a pond is a low oxygen environment. They also grow in a city, in a street tree. But their root systems are so aggressive, sometimes they rip up the concrete. So, you know, there are other things to think about. But just the fact that, and I agree with you, I think the greatest argument for using native plants is because they're so beneficial and so tied to the life cycle of our indigenous wildlife. You know, it's species specific to a great degree. And actually, if you read Doug Tallamy's book from the University of Delaware, he's very much into that and done some excellent work. Oak trees are one of the most beneficial trees you can plant to wildlife. And the other one is black cherry, but who wants to plant a black cherry in their yard? So.
Well, great. So this is some good input on into the complexities and the nuances of this particular strategy that we really weren't able to get into at the last meeting, and so I'm happy to spend a little extra time on it. We do have about 15 minutes and two others to get through, but I see one last question from Jim before we move on.
Yeah, real quick. Does the city have any landscape standards for commercial properties? Are they all the same, the standards for residential or subdivisions as they are for commercial properties?
So we are, at this point, the Planning Commission has a subcommittee that is updating the subdivision and land development ordinance, and that deals with both subdivisions and site plans. So, but I do think that the standards for landscaping are different, and I think more specified on the residential. So it's possible that we could come up with stronger landscape standards, one of the things that occurred to me as Rodney was talking is I think that the open space portion of what he talked about and having, connected open space has been a focus of the group that's reviewing the code. But, the whole issue of landscape standards could be for development, but it could also be, and Rodney's on our Parks and Recreation Commission, it could be landscape standards for the parks, if we could bring something like that to the commission, so that we could talk about the objectives of areas where we have water, maybe we do want a species that's going to take up more water. So I don't know, Randy, is that something we might want to think about too, in addition to for development?
Yeah, I think some better standards. I've come across some plans where they're putting street trees in a 4-foot planting strip between the curb and the sidewalk, and that's just not enough. And our reaction has been, give it at least 6, preferably 8, but we can't make them do it. That requires a change.
Well, 8 foot is what the current draft of the revision would do. Now, there are a lot of places in town where we have 4 feet, and we kind of have to live with the 4 feet.
Sure.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to move on. So our next strategy was raised freeboard. There's been a lot of discussion over the months on this particular strategy. But we did talk about, raising it by a fixed number, or whether perhaps it's raised in relation to sea level rise, again, picking a particular model, scenario, and time horizon in which the freeboard responds to those updates over time, so you don't always have to amend the actual ordinance itself. There's pros and cons, of course, increasing the cost to comply, but lowers flood insurance, increases property value, and it's a straightforward ordinance change, but it's just encompassed in existing kind of systems that the city's already doing, right? So we're just looking at that. Are there any other reactions to this particular strategy, or any other comments that you want to bring up that hasn't been brought up, or that you want to emphasize as we look at this one? Frank, go ahead.
Well, I think it's a little more complicated than just saying it's a straightforward, ordinance change. For example, if you were to increase the freeboard by 18 inches, you can't just walk away from that after you've changed it and say, oh, we fixed everything, because really all you've done in the immediate sense is just to increase the number of non-compliant properties that are affected by that ordinance. And then those properties that are in non-compliance, like Jim talked about last time, are under increased motivation to remain as they are, because, for example, with 18 inches, additional freeboard requirement is at least 3 more risers for a stair into your house. And then we also, I think, if we do say we have to raise the freeboard, and I'm not saying that we have to, consideration needs to be given to increasing the maximum building height. Otherwise, you create disparities among neighboring property owners. And by disparity, I mean a difference in property values amongst neighbors who are under theoretically the same zoning. So it's a lot more complicated than just taking the pen to the paper and say, okie dokie, it's 18 inches today, and that's not what it was yesterday.
Understood. Now, and we should have been a little more specific that was in regards to administrative on the city side in terms of our criteria, but you're absolutely right. There are other considerations in terms of that general catching up to ordinance increases. But go ahead, we have Joe and then Keena.
Well, with respect to this, of course, as we've seen before, the freeboard along the major coastal cities from Lewis southward are generally 12 inches of freeboard. Bethany has 18 inches. We have Cape May, which is 2 feet. Ocean City, I think, is 2 feet. I think Ocean City, Maryland, and New Jersey.
Actually, Ocean City, Maryland is 3. They have a variation, but go ahead, sorry to interrupt.
And if you look at Cape May, they, I believe in 2070, they have the same projected sea level rise as Lewis. Now they, with their 2 feet requirement, they do permit another foot of height addition. So if you had a 2 feet and people were allowed to go up to, I don't know what, I'm not sure what is in the city, but in the beach is 34 feet currently. If they were allowed to go up to 35 feet with a 24-inch freeboard requirement, I think there would be an inducement for people to do that, as opposed to a situation where if you simply add a freeboard and there's no increase in height, it could impact the value of the property. And I don't think we should be setting freeboard requirements on what may or may not happen in 2100, because we just don't know. Plus, freeboard it's not immutable. If things look like in the future that things are going to change for the worse or the better, you can adjust it. And people can I think a lot of people make informed decisions about what they want to do when they have the facts. And if somebody looks at the situation and sees that, like Philip said, it's plus or minus, let's just take 2070, maybe they want to construct their houses with a greater freeboard. But that's a decision they can make, and the question is, what do you mandate? And I looked, as I mentioned, the other coastal communities here, and Cape May, which a lot of its similarities with that, with Lewis, Ocean City, New Jersey, and I guess there's some nuances on Ocean City, Maryland, but it seemed to me that my view is that if you went up to 24 inches, which would be the intermediate step at 2070, and you permitted the person to increase their height if they wanted to up to 35 feet on the beach, that I think that would be something that could be accepted, but I don't know what the other people on the committee think.
Okay, well, let's hear from some other people. I see Kina has her hand up.
Yes, thank you. I think Frank has made an excellent point about it being very complicated. And this is something I've pondered and, tried to talk to others to get additional insight. And it appears to me that maybe we should even consider more qualified subcommittee to dig deeper on this. Let me give you an example that I heard about, and I'm going to apologize if my facts might be wrong, but if they are, we'll just use this as an example. Someone also expressed a concern about all the bigger houses that are being built here on Lewis Beach, and a lot of the older ones are going by the wayside. Not too long ago, in the last year or so, someone purchased a house that they were happy with the house, but they needed to add on a bedroom and a bath. That's all they wanted to do with it. And come to find out, they had to increase the level of that addition, which was fine, except that then they were mandated to redo the roof line. That was going to need to be addressed and affect the entire house. Anyway, it would cause a domino reaction. And unfortunately, if we are trying to preserve anything on Lewis Beach, this house had been there for a long, long time, and they ended up they demolished it and are going to start new. So what do we want to encourage, and are we really the committee that's qualified to dictate what that increase really should be? We might want to, like I said, do a subcommittee to explore or really to make that determination.
Okay, great. Okay, couple more comments on this, and then we do want to move on to the last one and our other agenda items. So I see Marta and I saw Jim. So Jim, go ahead.
I think this raising free board thing is a good thing for individuals to do to protect their own property. But I would prefer probably, if we are limited to one or two options as a committee, I would prefer to focus on something that would help the city be resilient, not just individual houses. As I said before, I think all of them are good, but I didn't realize we were going to be limited to one or two at the most because of the difficulty in drafting the regulations and things like that. So I think, in response to Kina's comment just now, I would think her comment about how qualified committee members are on any of these things is an issue. I mean, they are all involving technical things, but I think we can recommend something based on what other jurisdictions have been doing and their experiences with when they're in areas that have similar vulnerability to sea level rise.
Thanks, Marta. Correct. We are the committee for this, as we've been talking about all along. We've got some of the experts behind us to answer those questions. So if that was something that this committee chose to pursue, we could get that answer and that expertise. We have those experts and those expertise. So Jim, let's go to you, and then we're going to move on to the last to the reducing maximum lot coverage.
Sure. So I have a couple of issues with doing anything other than what the 18 inches is stated right now. I understand that is done and it has an effect on the National Flood Insurance Program for the city. So I'm good with that. I guess my question with this is raising the freeboard is solely for that particular property. So it has an effect on that particular property. It doesn't necessarily affect or mitigate flooding. It doesn't necessarily affect or mitigate sea level rise. It just mitigates damage to that particular property. So all of the other items that we're talking about, including landscape, if you increase landscaping on your property, it has an effect to sea level rise or mitigating flooding to your neighboring property, and therefore, has an effect on the city as a whole to help mitigate flooding. Raising the freeboard, again, I only see it as it affecting one's personal property. So the 18 inches is also from the base flood elevation of FEMA flood maps, which are based on historical data. However, those FEMA flood maps are revised over time. Certainly not every year, but I don't know what the timeline of when those FEMA maps are updated. So that 18 inches isn't a fixed number to begin with. It's a fixed number off the base flood elevation. The base flood elevation can change over time. It can go up and it can go down based on historical data. So for me, for doing anything more than the 18 inches that's stated, because that helps you be a part of the NFIP program, doesn't seem effective at all. It's what I think is actually effective is the real estate disclosure form to tell people that, hey, this is the sea level rise projection. this is the minimum base flood elevation. This is your freeboard above that base flood elevation, and it's between you, your insurance company, and and whoever else as to whether you want to go higher than that minimum required freeboard or not. Because again, it only affects that particular property. It doesn't really mitigate flooding. It doesn't mitigate sea level rise. It just mitigates damage to your property that you and only in the structures that you put on the property. That's it.
Okay, great, thanks, Jim. And then for last comment, we haven't heard from Frank. We'll also let you go, Frank, and then we do need to move on to the max lot coverage.
I'll be very brief. Just to confirm what Jim just said now with regard to the notion that base flood elevation can change, I can tell you from personal experience, we built our house in 2000 after demoing a family cottage that was built in the early 20s. And in between the time we built in 2000 and today, I couldn't really tell you when, not only did the base flood elevation change, but the line between AE and VE on our property moved. And it wasn't just our property, it was up and down the beach. So, yeah, those numbers can and will change, and I've seen it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so maximum lot, reducing maximum lot coverage would be the actual strategy. There was someone put out the idea of reducing it to 50%, which I think was the carryover from some previous proposals, but with an allowance for BMPs. Has the benefits, as we saw, I passed along the article from Phil where they said the 1% reduction or 1% of impervious coverage was related to 3% increase in flooding. Just as we said, we would provide some, kind of the academic and what the research was showing, and so we do have an indication of the effectiveness of that strategy. But again, it does depend upon the number of permits and the application of it, and there would be, and those going forward. So in terms of geographic area of impact, it's whether it's residential, whether it's non-residential, whether it's the entire city. So any additions, reactions, thoughts on this table or on this particular strategy? Sorry. Marta, go ahead.
This is the strategy that I think is most effective, and especially when you look at us, our city compared to neighboring jurisdictions. To be 65% coverage when impervious surface is a real problem for water absorption and to protect our houses, our city from flooding that is likely to happen. So I think it would be a good idea to go to 50%. Even 40%, but I just think, yes, I know it's tough with some of those smaller lots, but I guess this is only going to apply to new development and rebuilding also, so I think it's doable.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have any input, any thoughts?
Jen, can I add something?
Yes, please.
One thing I do want to address is it under geographic area of interest, it says entire city, residential and non-residential ? And the effect that this would have on the non-residential property would be much more significant, because right now non-residential property is in the non-residential zones, you're looking at 90 to 95% maximum lot coverage, so this reduces it almost in half. And so that may be more challenging to accommodate, especially because the non-commercial has, or the non-residential has the parking requirements as well. Just a practical consideration.
Great, thank you for that clarification, I appreciate it. I see the same hands that have been raised. Is there anyone who hasn't really spoken up, have something that they want to add before I go to Chris or Tom or Drew?
I'll hop in there.
Okay, go ahead.
Do we have further to what was just said, do we have any information on what percentage commercial property is of the town compared to residential?
We
I'm going
can,
to toss that to Anne Marie.
we can certainly, we don't have that at our fingertips, but we could certainly pull that together.
Okay. I mean, I'm having a hard time with this one, seeing it make a big impact, and I could be wrong. And I think I know I need more data to figure that out, but I just have a hard time visualizing how changing our lot coverage from 50 and 65 down to whatever, 40 and 50, whatever that might be. I just have a hard time seeing how that's going to have much of an effect on flooding. Now, if I'm told that, the residential space in Lewis is 80%, 90% versus, 10% commercial, and we're talking about a big change by making that percentage change overall to the city, okay, I can see that. But just initially, it seems to me it's really not going to make much of a dent.
Great.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, please.
Is this, when it says lot coverage, what are we talking about? We're talking about buildings and paving?
Correct. Not just building coverage, but both combined.
Does it change if you use permeable surfaces for your paving? Or is
That
that,
would,
If it's an engineered permeable surface, possibly.
that would be part of.
Part of the problem is a lot of things that are thought to be pervious are actually impervious. So we're utilizing what the state sediment and stormwater models use, which would classify things like stone and shell as impervious.
right, which they normally do. I mean, there's no doubt from my experience or perspective, the greater opportunity you have to get stormwater in contact with the ground where it can be absorbed rather than runoff, turned into runoff, it helps with reduced flooding. Now, there's always, if you have a storm that saturates the ground, well, the water's not going to go anywhere. It's going to run off. We all know that. But a lot of the water that we, and it's also for reasons of keeping the groundwater level where it needs to be and keeping the soil reasonably moist if you're going to want to grow trees and things. It's as a general rule, it's a good thing to get the water out into onto the ground. That's why pop-ups are so popular in downspouts, because the water comes up and has an opportunity to spread out over the planted surface before it meets any kind of a street or a gutter or anything. And if, I don't know. I mean, I think Chris raises a point. What difference is it going to make? I don't know what is that measurable. I'm sure it is, actually, but I don't know that we can sit here and say that it's going to make a big difference to change it by 10% one way or the other. And I think that if you're going to start including and be able to get credit for putting impermeable surfaces in, truly impermeable surfaces, where you actually get some storage capacity underneath the paved surface, those are good things to do, and you can do that. And the other thing is, it's a city, it's a town. It's not. We don't want to turn it into everything with this huge suburban lots. We want to keep a certain density, I would think, within the fabric of the community, so that it is a city. And so that to me comes into play too. I'm just thinking out loud. I'm sorry. I'm not giving you any particular point of view one way or the other. But I still think it's something we ought to look at and not write it off.
Well, thank you. We are fast running out of time. I know Joe, Frank, and Kina, you all have your hands up. I want to give each of you a turn, but I ask that you keep it as brief as possible and focus on some things that we perhaps haven't heard before in regards to this one. But go ahead, Joe, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, well, I think this is not a good idea for the beach. It's going to impact people's property values. We already have currently a 65% lot coverage. And I think there's a proposal currently to maintain that with the rest being pervious. I think if you look at Phil's paper they presented, it mentions that you can have a buffering effect depending on the permeability of the soil, sand, and of course at Lewis Beach we're mostly dealing with sand, and there's no showing that reducing the lot coverage is going to address any of the problems that we currently experience on Lewis Beach. That includes up at the canal flooding, Savannah Road. Lot coverage is not going to do anything. Dairy Queen Estates, as Charlie's mentioned, is working on that. And it's going to, in my judgment, since there isn't a clear rational connection, it's a taking of people's properties. If you try to, if you're now limited when you sell your property to 50% lot coverage, the value of your property has been reduced. The city's revenue has been reduced because you are going to get less for your property. So I'm strongly opposed to it in the absence of any further proof, at least as far as Lewis Beach is concerned. I can't speak to the city for restricting lot coverage to 50%.
Okay. So I think we have Frank and then Kina, and then I do need to move this along. But I think if we went into this impervious surface, the maximum lot coverage, we would have a further discussion on how it's not a taking and the kind of legal background behind that. But we're not going to go into that today. So Frank and then Kina, and then we're going to move to our next topic.
I'll be quick. I'll just echo what Joe said. I completely agree, and would add that just because if we were, and I'm not suggesting that we do, if we were to say, okay, lot coverage is 50%, by the time you actually achieve 50% in the entire neighborhood, it could be well over 100 years. You have to be motivated to reduce the size of your house, which has been made instantly non-conforming if it's already at 65%.
Kina?
My concern would be if we do have a devastating event, someone having to rebuild and yet make the place smaller, is that really fair? Is that equitable?
Okay. All right, so we are going to wrap this up. We are going to move so I want to go into the, hold on one second. Let me stop this share and bring up something else. So the last strategy that we have is increasing open space in new subdivisions. And I just want to bring up, so on the city's website, there is the draft subdivision and land development code amendment. And it does include, so this is, I had the section number written somewhere, but this is under the general standards for subdivisions, open space requirements. And so here we go, move it up, sorry. So under number 4, you're seeing with the strikeout is what's being deleted and the underline is what is proposed. So the subdivision subcommittee is currently proposing that 20% of a subdivision So the open space being increased to 20% for a standard subdivision, and then additional open space is required for multifamily planned community or cluster options. Can everybody see the ordinance that I have up? Good, okay, thank you. Sorry, I should have checked on that a minute. In regards to Rodney's previous comments, and they do have a whole section on the open space configuration, and in terms of contiguity and minimum size of the open space in order for it to count minimum or maximum impervious, and structures that are allowed or not allowed in this case, and basins in it. So what I would like to do is give this committee a chance to look it over, and then, but in essence, take it off of our plate, right? So we have six strategies right now, but if this one is already kind of in the pipeline, it had a public meeting in November, and the next step would be to take those comments under revision and make revisions, and then bring it back to the Planning Commission sometime in early 2022. But give this committee a chance to take it off their plate and but also lend support to the ordinance as it's written or provide comments. We can do that at the January meeting, and then we can move along to the ranking. But is there comments or discussion or comfort levels with that idea? Marta?
I support the open space proposal here. I do wonder about the at least 60% of it shall be usable open space. In other words, the property owner who has a lot of wetland there, it's going to be easy. A good portion of his open space is not usable anyway, so he or she is not given anything there. We had that happen with the Birmingham property. A lot of the open space, unfortunately, was wetlands, and it wasn't really a give to, it wasn't really something added to the open space, in my opinion. But I do support that, and I don't think we need to pursue it with another committee doing it as well.
Okay. Any other thoughts or reactions to that strategy? Frank?
Aside from areas that would potentially be annexed, where in Lewis would this apply? Are there plots that this ordinance is motivated to apply to?
There's a small amount of undeveloped land where this would apply. Agree with you that there's not a lot, and every month that passes probably less, but there is some land that this would apply to.
Does anyone have an issue with taking the open space off of our list of potential strategies to rank for today? No. Okay. So then what we'll do is put on the January committee meeting agenda discussion, and whether we want to actually have a formal vote to support the amendments that have been proposed by the subdivision subcommittee. And then we can move on to our to ranking. And so the idea is that we are left with 5, and I can share my screen again so that you can see the table. Go on to the 5. Where did it go? There we go. Sure. So we'll go back to our 5 and their pluses and minuses, so to speak, or their characteristics. And then each one of you, I'm going to ask, similar to what we did when we narrowed it down to your top 5, we did a vote. At that time, I actually put Jim Baker on the spot because we did alphabetical order and he was first. This time I'm going to reverse it. But I'd like for everyone to rank 1 being the most important strategy to you, down to 5 being the least important strategy to you, priority for strategy going forward. And so, not to put you on the spot, but Frank, do you feel like you'd be ready to go ahead and do that?
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'll start at the beginning. Real estate disclosure and resiliency fund, I'll lump together and give them, like a 1, 2 for each. and you can pick whichever, 1 and 2 or 2 and 1.
Okay. I put 1 for real estate disclosure and 2 for resilience.
Okay. And then landscape standards, I would give a 3.
Okay.
And I have no 4. I'm going to put lot coverage and freeboard both at 5. Or 6 if that's available, or maybe
We're going to stick with the 5.
Okay.
All right. Yep, we'll stick with the 5. Okay, thank you. Candace?
I would put the Resiliency Fund as my number 1,
Okay.
real estate disclosure as my number 2.
Okay.
I'm looking at the revised landscape standards as number 3. Freeboard is number 4, and what am I missing?
The maximum lot coverages.
Maximum lot coverage. I'd put that as number 5.
Great. Okay. Khalil is not with us today. Kina?
Well, my job was made easy because my list is like Frank said, so I'm in agreement with him. Disclosure be my top, resiliency. As a matter of fact, I thought this was nice that you kind of put them in order, Jim. Then the landscaping. I have a lot of concerns on the last 2. I might, I just have a lot of concerns about those 2. I will put both of those at 5, as Frank had said, if we can do that.
Let's see where we end up. Okay, Rodney. Oh, Rodney, you're muted.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm saying I'm pretty much with everyone else. Number 1 for me is real estate disclosure. 2 is resiliency fund. 3 is landscape standards, and freeboard, and then maximum lot coverage.
Okay. 5. Okay. Tom Panetta.
This is very difficult because, frankly, given the charter of the Lewis Executive Committee on Resiliency, I don't see how any of these are going to address the problems with climate change and sea level rise. I do not see the need to raise freeboard, but I do see the need to address sea level rise and increased precipitation. And those would be my number 1 items, but they're not on the list. Landscaping, I don't think is gonna help. I'm all for landscaping, but I don't think it's gonna help. I don't think the maximum lot coverage necessarily is going to address the executive committee charter, even though it addresses other issues. The resiliency fund, in concept, it's a nice idea. However, I don't see how there will be anywhere near enough funding provided to address the recovery efforts needed post-storm. So, disclosure is probably the best, and if that's all this committee is going to do, then I think we move forward with that and we address the rest of this issue in some other form. I'm frankly very disappointed in the outcome. Thank you.
Sorry to hear that. Okay, so Marta?
Could I ask, Tom, you mentioned 2 things that you think should have been on there, and I didn't quite catch them.
Sure. I had proposed early on in these sessions that we we look into an ordinance that would address the changes in precipitation and the impacts on flooding and incorporate that into the city ordinances. Many other towns and cities have done that, and it is frankly what NOAA and FEMA are recommending, given the fact that Atlas 14 is not going to be updated within the next 5 years.
So an ordinance that would do what, though?
Well, it would look basically at putting in place something other than the 100-year flood map that we're currently using, because the 100-year flood map is historic. And just as Phil had mentioned, the rate of increases has increased over time, and Atlas 14 is grossly out of date. And as I stated earlier, the 100-year storm is going to become the 25-year storm, and the 25-year storm is going to become the 10-year storm in the not distant future.
Goes into that.
Okay, thank you. Did that cover everything? Yeah,
Talking about that data, honey.
Okay, then I guess I will rank mine if you're finished, right, Tom? I think, given the choices we have, I would still say lot coverage would be number one, and I think we can move to commercial properties too. I mean, we need to take care of the city, not only worry about effects on people's property values, because there will be no property value if everything's flooded in the end. So lot coverage.
She knows more than anybody else.
Lot coverage. Yeah, I do know everything more than everyone else, I guess. You know, that was very good. I do with your mic on, okay? Maybe I'll just leave because this is, you know. Thank you. Landscape number 2. Resiliency Fund number 3. Freeboard number 4, because that's only about protecting the individual house, not helping the city, and same with the real estate. I mean, what that's going to do, the real estate disclosure, I think it's just going to tell people, don't buy that house, or you go ahead and buy that house, but how does it protect the city? So those are my choices.
Thank you, Marta, for your thoughtful input. Okay. Drew?
I share some of Tom Panetta's concerns, as I have stated for this committee and during the committee. We're not really addressing all 3 water issues, which are stormwater, groundwater, and sea level rise. I think the ranking of the items by everyone today is primarily based on what's easiest to do and what affects people the least. I do agree that there are other alternatives we should be talking about, but to rank these, to give you a simple answer, I think lot coverage should be number 1. I think the Resiliency Fund number 2, real estate and landscaping are really much comparable, and freeboard is number 5.
Joe Kelly?
I'm going to go with how they're listed here. Real estate disclosure, resiliency, revised landscape, raised freeboard, and the last one would be lot coverage.
Okay. Okay. Chris Creel?
Yeah, and I will have to agree that I kind of feel like we're heading in a direction where we're not going to really be making much of an impact here. But with these 5, I'm going to say real estate disclosure, the landscape standards for 2, resiliency fund 3, lot coverage 4, and freeboard 5.
I'm sorry, lot coverage was 4 and freeboard was 5. Okay. And Jim Baker, I know you're on the phone.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, great.
Yep, sorry about that. Thank you. So, yeah, I actually have Resiliency Fund as number one, and I think I stated this before, I actually think that's probably the one that would make the most effect, and I say that because I don't see this Resiliency Fund as a post-disaster fund, because Tom is right. Like, there would not be enough money to help that. That comes from the federal level in most cases. So this resiliency fund is more in lines with property buyback programs, with encouraging, like Rodney had stated, in coordination with other grant opportunities to do replenishment, marsh replenishment, and other measures that are effective to help mitigate sea level rise. So I see that as actually number one and being effective. The other ones are less effective, but some are easy but important. I think landscape would be number two for me. Real estate disclosure number three. And then I would say actually lot coverage number four. And then number five would be freeboard.
Okay, great. Thank you. And that, thank you, yes. I think, and that was, we have everybody. That covers our agenda for today. I'm, sorry to hear some of the disappointment of some of the committee members, and perhaps there'll be a chance to hear some of those opinions and underlying trying to move this along given our time period, but we certainly want to hear of some other options. So, but as we are, we will look over the table, look through the voting. I will send it out to everyone so that we can see what kind of the top choices were, though it certainly looked like the real estate and the Resiliency Fund were definitely 1 and 2 for the majority of the folks here. This is our last meeting for 2021. Our next meeting is January 14th. Hold on one second.
I think 11th,
Sure.
January 11th.
The 11th, thank you, Emery. Yep, so January 11th, same time and place. And we will have that discussion about the open space as well as jump into a couple of the top 2 priorities as we go. But I do want to thank you all for the conversation and for your thoughtfulness through the entire process, not just today, but over previous months. And I think we don't have any, well, we have Brent and we have Charlie in the public, so unless there's any other public have joined you, Anne-Marie, I don't think we have any public comment.
Charlie wishes to make no comment.
Excellent. All right. And with that, I'm going to adjourn the meeting and again say thank you and have a great holiday and wish you best wishes for the new year, and we will see you in January.
Thank you all. Thank you.
So the whole time, the